I was still holding my coat when Mr. Calder slid the folder across the marble console toward Grant and said in a flat voice, "Sign here. The scholarship trust gets reassigned tonight." Cynthia did not look at me. She tapped her nails on the paper, like time was something she owned. She does not need to understand. She said she is not family. The room smelled like lemon polish and money, and the quiet was so clean it hurt. I remember thinking, this is how it happens. Not with shouting, not with slammed doors, just paperwork and people who decide you do not count. I looked at the folder and read the title without touching it. Harbor Scholarship Trust Amendment and Beneficiary Reassignment. Grant would not meet my eyes. He stood there like a child waiting to be told whether he had passed a test. Fine, I thought. If they want paperwork, I will give them paperwork. That ends this. I am Ivy. I am 26. I dress simply. I speak when it matters. And my fiancé Grant is 33. He believes peace means silence. His family lives in Edina, Minnesota, the kind of new money that worships legacy and calls it virtue. That night was not a dinner for me. It was a meeting about money where I happened to be present. Cynthia smiled at everyone except me. "You are the affordable option," she said softly, like a favor. Paige laughed. "Grant, did you find her on a coupon app? They did not invite me to the main table. I was placed near the kitchen so you can help if needed." Paige brushed past me and drove her shoulder into my side, hard enough that the edge of the table bit back. She murmured, "Sorry, like it was weather. I tasted metal and swallowed it. What mattered was the folder." I saw the words, "amendment and reassignment" again, and my eyes caught the problem immediately. A duty bent where it should not bend, a purpose clause stretched thin like a lie. I did not ask questions because I understood the terms. When Mr. Calder used legal language, I did not need a translation. I noticed the watch on my wrist reflected the chandelier. Simple to everyone else, rare to the few who know Cynthia, leaned toward Grant and said it clearly. "After you marry her, we will have her sign a waiver. Then she is harmless." My chest tightened. Not panic, not tears. Clarity. If you have ever been judged for looking simple, comment. I am here because this is where it started. The dinner moved like a script. Cynthia asked what I did. So cashier or receptionist? Paige added, "At least she is quiet, that is useful." Luke arrived late and took the best seat. They called him the future of the family. Though he had not paid his own bills in months, Tom said no prenup, no wedding. Grant said they are joking, and the lie was louder than anything else. Paige grabbed my wrist to pull me toward the kitchen and hissed, "Do not make faces." Her fingers left heat and later a bruise. "Ivy, stop overthinking," Grant said when I showed him the mark. "Paige is clumsy." The next morning, Cynthia emailed, "Come by tomorrow." Paperwork, I checked public records, not with a search bar, but with the right doors. Harbor Trust was not small. It sat on property and stock and a scholarship that changed lives. I saw the numbers and felt my stomach go cold. They were not trimming. They were draining. I found a consulting fee paid to Luke the same week his debt came due. Then I heard the plan by accident. Cynthia said she is a placeholder. We keep her calm until the trust is moved. Paige said if she fights, we say she is unstable. Tom said everything stays in Luke, name. I understood the waiver they wanted. It would close doors forever. I said yes and started a file. I kept a folder and a timeline. I saved emails, texts, photos of the bruise dates of meetings. I wrote down insults word for word because words matter. Paige told me, "Sign it or you are done." Grant handed me a prenup. I asked one question. Who drafted this? Which firm? He did not answer. I do not sign what I do not understand. I met Miss Rowan, a trust and estate attorney in Minneapolis. She confirmed what I saw, a breach of duty dressed as planning. She told me to build, leverage, and ask for a formal accounting. If we have a witness inside, this ends fast, she said. I thought of Mr. Calder. I learned Luke was a black hole. Loans, late payments, and spending. Cynthia called building something. Paige showed off a new car paid with trust money. Tom tried to make me sign an acknowledgement that I had no claim. I asked quietly, "Why does a scholarship need my waiver?" Grant snapped, "Stop interrogating." Then an email arrived by mistake. Transfer amount. $4.2 million in 1 year. I spoke to Calder about risk and ethics. He said he was executing instructions. I offered an exit ramp. Execute them correctly with accounting. Cynthia accused me of snooping. Tom touched my arm again. I said, "Do not put your hands on me." Their answer was a foundation gala, a stage to make it official. I prepared exhibits, timelines, bank trails, trust language witnesses. Rowan sent notice of accounting. "If they sign tonight," she texted, "we freeze it tomorrow, then we go tonight at the gala." Cynthia announced the legacy plan. I stepped forward calm and named the insults. Affordable option coupon app. I showed the change of purpose, the money trail, the irregular authority. Calder produced the accounting file. Banks and CPAs watched. The room went quiet. They tried to gaslight me. I said, "Money did not change you. You changed when you thought I had none." Comment, "Finish it if you want what happened," after they tried to crawl back. And when I said the transfer was scheduled for midnight, the silence finally broke. The dinner was presented as a welcome, but I knew within the first 5 minutes that it was a test and not the kind you could study for. The table was set. Too formally, the candles were unlit and Mr. Calder sat at the far end with a legal pad already open. Cynthia called it a family dinner, but folders sat beside the salt and pepper, like they belonged there. I took my seat where they pointed near the kitchen doorway and told myself to breathe. This is normal, I thought. People talk about money at dinner all the time. Cynthia smiled across the table and tilted her head at me. "So, Ivy," she said, drawing my name out like a measurement. "What do you do again? Cashier or receptionist?" Paige did not even wait for my answer. She laughed lightly and waved her fork. "At least she is quiet, that is useful." Luke arrived late and took the best chair without apology. Cynthia beamed. "There he is, our future." The words landed heavy, because Luke lived off his parents and missed payments, like appointments. Tom cleared his throat and said, "Before we get too comfortable, there are things to settle. No prenup, no wedding." The sentence was sharp and casual like a rule. Everyone already knew. Grant shifted beside me and said, "They are joking, trying to smooth it like a wrinkle," but no one laughed. Paige reached for my wrist to pull me toward the kitchen, and her fingers tightened as she whispered, "Do not make faces." The grip burned, and I felt my skin flush, but I said nothing. In the kitchen, she told me to help carry plates as if that was my role. I watched the door frame and thought about exits. When we returned, Mr. Calder slid a document closer to the center. "Amendment draft," he said, tapping the header. I leaned forward just enough to read, and my mind snapped awake. A fiduciary duty clause bent where it should not bend. The purpose language softened into something vague. Cynthia noticed my eyes and smiled sweetly. "You do not need to worry about that, dear. This is family business," Paige added. She would not understand anyway. Grant nodded weakly. "They are just planning ahead." Luke smirked and said, "It is for the legacy. You should be grateful." Tom poured wine and said again, "No prenup, no wedding like a gavel." I focused on the paper and saw the phrase that mattered, "Transfer to Holding LLC." My stomach tightened because I knew what that meant. A scholarship does not need a holding company unless someone plans to change its purpose. The room kept talking around me, jokes about weddings and photos, but the words blurred. I thought about how quiet power looks like nothing until it moves. I folded my napkin carefully and told myself, this is where doubt starts. If you are not careful, you convince yourself you are overreacting. I was not. The dinner was never for me. It was about moving money and seeing if I would notice. I went home that night and locked the door behind me with a steadiness that surprised even me. The house was quiet, and when I set my bag down, I finally looked at my wrist under the kitchen light. The bruise had bloomed dark and clear in the shape of fingers. They would call it an accident. Later, I knew that already. But my body did not call it an accident. My body called it a warning. When Grant came in, I showed him without a word. He glanced and shrugged. "Paige is clumsy," he said like that, explained pressure and intent. I asked him to sit, and he did not. He hovered as if staying too long would make him responsible. I slept badly and woke early to an email from Cynthia. "Come by tomorrow." Paperwork. The word landed heavier than it should have. I made coffee and let it cool while I stared at the bruise again. Then I opened my laptop. Not to search blindly. Not to guess, I went straight to the records. I knew where to look because that was what I did. I pulled the Harbor Trust filings and followed the trail. Through property records and corporate disclosures, it was not small. It was not symbolic. The scholarship fund was tied to rental properties and long-term holdings. Numbers stacked into millions, not tens of thousands. The money was real, and so was the risk. I traced amendments and saw timing patterns that did not belong to generosity. They were pulling value to cover losses. I saw debt signals tied to Luke and felt the last thread of doubt snap. This was not planning. This was extraction. By noon, I had mapped enough to know they were using the scholarship to rescue failing bets. I closed the files when another notification appeared. A consulting fee paid to Luke dated the same day his debt notice was filed. The bruise on my wrist throbbed, and I thought, this is the receipt. They used words and hands and paper and expected silence. I replied to Cynthia simply, "Yes, tomorrow," and shut the computer. The next step was no longer confusion, it was clarity. I went back the next afternoon to pick up a sweater I had left on the chair by the window, and I told myself I would be in and out, nothing more. The house felt different, quieter in a way that carries secrets. I heard voices before I reached the hallway, and I stopped, because my name was said without kindness. Cynthia spoke first, and there was no effort to lower her voice. "She is a placeholder," she said. "We keep her calm until the trust is moved." Paige answered immediately. "If she fights, we say she is unstable." Like it was a strategy, not a cruelty. Tom added, "We will keep everything in Luke's name." The sentence settled into me with a cold precision, and something inside me finally broke clean. Not loudly, just completely. I understood then that this was not about disliking me, it was about using me. Marriage was the lock. The waiver was the key. They planned to close every door that would let me challenge what they were doing. I knew exactly which waiver they meant, the kind that sounds reasonable and reads. Final, I stayed still and let the words finish carving the truth. I stepped back only when the printer whirred and a page slid out unattended. I glanced at it as I passed. Bank appointment, Monday 9 a.m. I took my sweater and left without a sound. In the car, I sat and breathed until my hands stopped shaking. Then I made the decision that changed everything. I would say yes. I would let them believe I was calm, harmless, useful. I would build a case file and let paper speak for me. I said yes with a steady voice and a soft smile, and I watched relief move through their faces like a wave, as if my consent was a form of obedience. Grant squeezed my hand and whispered, "Thank you," like I had saved him from discomfort, not like I had accepted a life with him. On the drive home, I did not cry. I did not replay the insults to punish myself. I did what I always did when something stopped making sense. I built a system. I cleared my kitchen table and placed a plain manila folder in the center, then another, then another. I labeled them by date and category: emails, texts, trust, drafts, prenup, physical, and I opened a notebook with clean-lined paper. On the first page, I wrote the exact words Cynthia had used at the start of the week. "You are the affordable option." I wrote the exact words Paige had used to laugh at my place in their world. "Grant, did you find her on a coupon app?" I wrote them not because I wanted to feel them again, but because evidence starts with precision. I taped a printed calendar page to the wall above my desk and began a timeline board in the simplest way. Blue pen and clear dates. Dinner at Adina House. Bruise visible. Cynthia email. Come by tomorrow. Paperwork. Overheard conversation. Bank appointment. Monday 9 a.m. I printed the email from Cynthia and added it to the folder I saved. Screenshots of texts from Grant where he downplayed everything and told me to relax. I took a photo of the bruise in natural light and printed it too, because memory can be denied but ink does not argue. I added my notes from the public records search and the consulting fee to Luke, and I marked the date of his debt notice beside it, like matching fingerprints. In the days that followed, Paige escalated from ridicule to pressure. She cornered me in the hallway with her smile sharpened and said, "Sign it or you are done," meaning the prenup, meaning the waiver, meaning my place. Grant handed me the prenup a few nights later at my apartment with a tone that tried to be gentle. "Just sign," he said. "It is normal. It is what they want." I took the papers and did not touch a pen. I asked one question that made him blink like a curtain had lifted. "Who drafted this? Which firm?" He stared at me, and for the first time in weeks, he looked unsure. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply said, "I do not sign anything I do not understand." The sentence was calm, but it changed the air between us. He tried to laugh and failed. He said his parents handled it, that it was standard. I nodded and flipped to the signature page because the end of a document often tells the truth faster than the beginning. I looked at the prior trustee's signature and felt my focus sharpen. The ink weight was inconsistent. The slant changed mid-name as if two hands had tried to be one. I set the page down and kept my face neutral because this was not the moment for confrontation. This was the moment to add another tab to the file and to understand that what they were doing was not just cruel, it might be careless enough to prove. I drove into Minneapolis on a gray morning with my folder on the passenger seat like it was a second heartbeat. The city felt busy, but my mind was quiet, in the way it gets when the next move is clear. I had an appointment with Ms. Rowan, a trust and estate attorney, whose office sat in a building that smelled like paper and certainty. She did not waste time on charm. She read my documents in silence and asked only the questions that mattered. Who holds fiduciary responsibility? Who drafted the amendment? Who benefits from the change? I pointed to the lines that bothered me, and she nodded, as if she had seen this story too many times. She tapped the phrase, "Transfer to Holding LLC," and said slowly, "Changing the purpose of a scholarship fund and moving it into an LLC can be a breach of fiduciary duty, especially if the trust language is specific and the beneficiaries are children, not adults. Financing lifestyle." I felt something tighten and then release because hearing it aloud turned fear into structure. She asked about the money and I told her what my records showed. The scholarship was not a jar of donations. It was tied to rental properties and equity positions and family shares that produce steady income. It was built to last, and that meant it was also tempting. She leaned back and said, "That is why they want you to sign." A waiver does not just keep peace. It can limit standing and make challenges harder, especially after marriage when they can frame everything as consent. I did not interrupt. I listened because the point was not to feel righteous. The point was to be effective. I asked what we could do without starting a public fight. She slid a legal pad toward me and wrote 2 words, "Formal accounting." She explained it in plain language the way women her age appreciate because it is practical, not dramatic. You request records, you demand the ledger, you ask for the timeline of transactions, the agreements, the minutes, the approvals. If they are clean, they will comply. If they are not, they will stall, and stalling creates leverage. I asked for exactly that, a formal accounting request, and she nodded again, then said, "I will draft it as a letter that looks boring and feels heavy, because boring paperwork is what moves institutions." She looked at my bruise photo and did not ask for a story. She simply said, "Keep documenting. I will also advise one thing. No confrontation. Build leverage." The words were firm, like a hand on my shoulder, not to comfort, but to steady me. She paused and then studied my face. "You work in finance?" she asked. Not as a guess, but as recognition, I kept my voice neutral. "Something like that," I said, because I was not ready to name myself even here. Not fully. Not yet. She handed me a copy of the draft letter and highlighted the parts that mattered: the request for accountings, the list of documents, the deadlines, the consequences of noncompliance. I placed it in my folder and felt my plan become real, not just anger organized into action. As I stood to leave, Miss Rowan added one more thing: if we have a witness inside, this ends fast. The sentence hung in the air like a door opening in my mind, and immediately I saw Mr. Calder at the table with his legal pad, his tired eyes, his careful distance. I nodded as if I was only considering options, but inside I was already thinking about what kind of man he was and whether he wanted to be on the right side of the record. Silence became their invitation. Every time I held my tongue, they stepped closer, as if my quiet was permission to take more, to push harder, to tighten the circle around me. I kept building my file, and the more I collected, the clearer Luke became, not as a person, but as a drain, a black hole that swallowed money and returned nothing. I found the HELOC entries tied to property addresses connected to the trust portfolio. I saw late payment notices that lined up with bursts of spending. I did not need to label it with anything dramatic. I only noted the pattern: quick cash out, and then a scramble to cover it. There were transactions that looked like weekend losses disguised as normal expenses, and I wrote gambling-ish spending in my notes without making it a headline, because the point was not scandal. The point was motive. When I went back to Adina for another family dinner, the atmosphere was warmer on the surface and colder underneath. Cynthia smiled as if we were already fixed. She spoke about Luke, like he was the sun and everyone else was just orbiting. Luke is building something. She said with pride, the way people say that when they cannot name what is being built. Paige agreed and laughed and called him the future of the family again, even though I had never once seen him do anything but take. And then Paige came outside to show off her new car as if it had arrived by magic. It was the kind of vehicle that turns heads on suburban streets, and she ran her hand along the door like it was a trophy. Cynthia watched her with approval and said, "Nothing is too good for our family." I stood there and thought about scholarship checks and rental income, and kids who would never know their future had been traded for leather seats. Tom called me back inside and placed a paper in front of me, like a plate I did not ask for. It was an acknowledgement statement that I had no claim to the Harbor Scholarship Trust and no standing to question its management. He spoke in that calm business voice men use when they want control to sound reasonable. "Sign this," he said. "It is just housekeeping." I read it once, then again, and felt my chest tighten, because this was the trap made simple. They were trying to build a wall of consent around their actions so that later they could say I had agreed. I looked at Tom and asked one question in the same calm tone: "Why does a scholarship need my waiver?" The room shifted. Paige laughed, like I had said something childish. Cynthia's smile pinched, and Tom's eyes hardened for the first time, because my question hit the truth. Luke needed money, and they needed cover. Grant stepped in quickly and said, "Ivy, please," like I was embarrassing him. Tom said, "It is standard." And Cynthia added, "If you are joining this family, you should not be difficult." Paige leaned close enough that I could smell her perfume, and she whispered with a smile, "Sign it, or you are done." Grant took the paper and brought it to me later, like he was delivering a peace offering. "Just sign." He said again, "It will make them stop." He sounded tired, and I understood he did not want justice. He wanted quiet. I did not sign. I asked again, "Who benefits from this?" and he flinched as if the word benefit was a slap. He snapped for the first time, "Stop interrogating." He said loud enough that the room went still. In that moment, my vomong deepened because the man I was supposed to marry chose their comfort over my safety, and he did it without hesitation. I said nothing back because arguing would feed their narrative that I was unstable. Instead, I placed the paper neatly on the table and watched them watch me as if waiting for me to break. When I left, I kept my posture steady, but inside I felt the last soft place in me harden into resolve. That night, an email landed in my inbox, by mistake or by carelessness, a forwarded internal note with one line that made my stomach drop. Transfer amount $4.2 million in the year. I stared at the number until it stopped looking like ink and started looking like theft, and I realized they were already rushing toward midnight with or without my signature. The number from that mistaken email sat behind my eyes all week, like a bright warning sign. $4.2 million in the year was not housekeeping, it was extraction. And the closer they got to moving it, the more they acted like nothing was happening. I did not blow up. I did not accuse anyone in public. I did what Ms. Rowan told me to do. I began pulling them into the light without turning on every lamp at once. My first step was Mr. Calder, because he was the hinge between their intentions and the paperwork that could make those intentions real. I requested a short meeting with him under the pretense of clarifying a document term, and he agreed with the reluctant politeness of a man who preferred to stay invisible. We met in a quiet corner of a coffee shop near the office park where the Calder group kept its suites. He wore the same careful expression he had at the dinner, the face of someone who has learned to survive rich families by never taking a side. I did not threaten him. I did not flatter him. I spoke to him the way I speak. When I need someone to understand risk, I said I have a question. Not about feelings, but about professional exposure. I said trusts and amendments create records, and records create liability. If the purpose is being changed and the funds are being routed through an LLC, someone will ask why, and the first name on the execution line will be yours. He stared at his cup and exhaled slowly, then finally said the line that told me everything I needed to know: I am just executing instructions. His voice was flat, like a man repeating a policy. He tried to make himself small inside the sentence, but a small man can still be held accountable. I leaned forward and gave him the exit ramp Miss Rowan had hinted at, and I made sure my tone stayed calm, then execute it correctly with accounting. I said, if you are only executing instructions, then you protect yourself by insisting the accounting is clean, that the approvals are documented, that the fiduciary language is respected. If it is clean, you have nothing to fear. If it is not, you do not want your signature anywhere near it. He looked up at me, then not with warmth, but with calculation, as if he was measuring the size of the cliff he was approaching. I could see the moment where fear became practical thought. He did not promise me anything because men like him do not promise, they position. But his eyes shifted, and I knew he had heard me. When I returned to Adina that weekend, the house felt different. Not because anyone had softened, but because I had stopped hoping they had dinner plates set out like a performance of family unity, and Cynthia wore a smile that looked practiced in a mirror. Paige watched me the way a cat watches a closed door. Tom stood near the hallway like a guard, and Grant hovered between them and me like a man trying to keep two storms from colliding. I had barely taken off my coat when Cynthia said, with a casual sharpness that made my stomach tighten, "I heard you have been asking Mr. Calder questions." She said it like an accusation dressed up as conversation. Paige laughed and added, "Oh my God, she is snooping." Cynthia repeated it louder for effect. "She is snooping." She looked at Grant as if my curiosity was a personal embarrassment she deserved compensation for. I kept my face neutral because if I defended myself, they would call it aggression, and if I apologized, they would call it guilt. I simply said, "I asked for clarity on trust language. That is not snooping. That is reading." Cynthia's smile thinned, and she said, People who join a family do not dig into private affairs. They show respect. Tom stepped closer and placed his hand on my upper arm, not hard but controlling, like he was steering an object into place. In the past, that touch might have made me freeze because it was subtle enough to deny and clear enough to intimidate. But this time, I looked directly at his hand and then at his face, and I said the boundary out loud in a voice that did not shake. "Don't put your hands on me again." The room went quiet for a beat. Paige stopped smiling. Grant's mouth opened as if he wanted to soften it into a joke, but no sound came out. Cynthia's eyes flashed with outrage because I had done the one thing she could not control. I had named the behavior. Tom removed his hand slowly, as if he was the injured party, and Cynthia stepped in fast to repair his image. She said, "Ivy is sensitive. She has been stressed. She says things." She turned to Grant and said, "You see what I mean? She is unstable." Paige nodded eagerly, like she had been waiting for that word to be approved. I did not react because my power was not in matching their volume. My power was in the fact that I was no longer alone. I had a lawyer, and that meant every email, every touch, every demand was now part of a pattern that could be documented and acted on. I could feel their control cracking, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a hairline fracture, running through the old assumption that I would stay quiet forever. Cynthia recovered with a new strategy the kind, wealthy women use when private pressure stops working. She announced with bright energy that they were planning a foundation gala, a public event to celebrate legacy and community and scholarship. She said it like it was charity, but I heard what it really was, a stage, a way to legitimize their plan in front of witnesses to wrap paperwork in applause. The first crack in their control had formed, and without realizing it, Cynthia had chosen the exact place where the crack could split wide open. Cynthia called it a foundation gala, like the word itself could wash away intent, but I heard the machinery behind it, the way she wanted signatures to happen, while people were smiling and holding champagne, the way she wanted the trust to be stamped as a celebration instead of questioned as a transfer. They wanted to close the lid in front of an audience so it would feel inevitable, so anyone who objected later would look rude, unstable, ungrateful. I let her talk and I nodded at the right moments, and inside I translated every sentence into what it really meant. This is where they plan to lock it. This is where they plan to make it public enough to intimidate me. The irony was almost quiet. They were building their own courtroom without a judge and handing me the microphone by accident. The next morning, I cleared my kitchen table and turned it into a work surface, the way I do when I have a problem that cannot be solved by emotion. I started assembling what Miss Rowan had told me to build leverage, not noise. I created an exhibit pack, not a dramatic binder with labels for show, but a plain folder system with tabs that made the story impossible to misunderstand. First tab was the timeline board translated into paper dates locations, who said what, who demanded what, and each entry matched to something concrete: an email, a text message, a photo, a calendar invite, a screenshot. Second tab was the bank trail, as clean as I could make it from what I had the consulting fee payments to Luke, the timing that matched his debt deadlines, the pattern of withdrawals that did not look like scholarships, but looked like survival spending for the family. Third tab was the trust language rewritten in plain English because I was not going to let them hide behind legal phrasing. I took the key phrases: beneficiary reassignment amendment draft, fiduciary duty transfer to holding LLC, and I wrote one sentence under each, what it meant, who it protected, and who it harmed. I kept hearing Cynthia from that first night saying, I did not need to understand because I was not family, and I felt my throat tighten for a moment before I forced it down. Understanding was the whole point. Understanding was the only armor that worked in rooms like theirs. Miss Rowan did her part with the efficiency of a woman who had seen wealthy families try to bury the truth under manners. She prepared and sent a notice of accounting, a formal request that demanded records and explanations in a way that could not be brushed off as feelings. It was ordinary paper, normal letterhead, proper language, but it carried weight because it created a clock. The moment they received it, their options narrowed. Either they complied or they exposed themselves by refusing. Either way, the story moved forward. I watched the delivery confirmation on my phone and felt something settle in me. Not joy, not revenge, but structure. Then I went to collect what Ms. Rowan had called the fastest end a witness inside the machine. We could not rely only on my observations and what I could find in public records. We needed someone who had touched the money when it still belonged to its purpose. I started with the old fund accountant, the person who had handled the scholarship side before Cynthia and Tom treated it like their private reserve. I did not show up with accusations. I asked questions like a professional and let the silence do the work. When she met me in a quiet diner outside Minneapolis, she looked tired in a way that felt familiar, like she had spent years watching something good get twisted and did not know how to stop it without losing her livelihood. She told me she had stopped working with them after repeated requests to classify expenses in ways that made her uncomfortable, little shifts, at first reimbursements that did not match receipts, allocations that did not line up with the stated purpose. She never used the word fraud. She did not need to. She said I kept notes because I felt crazy. She said they would smile and say it was for the kids, then ask me to move numbers so it looked tidy. I asked if she would be willing to confirm in writing what she had seen, what she had been asked to do, and when. She hesitated, then nodded once tight and controlled. I could tell she hated the risk, but she hated the memory of being used more. From there, I contacted the property manager for the rental units tied to the trust, the one I had found through the county records that listed a management company name. He was brisk on the phone until I asked one technical question that told him I was not a nosy fiancé looking for gossip. I asked about the capitalization schedule and whether any reserve funds had been diverted into a holding structure. There was a pause, the kind that happens when someone realizes you speak their language. When we met in his office, he told me he had received instructions to reroute certain payments and hold them in a separate account, pending new ownership structure. He said it was framed as administrative, but the timing was strange, and the urgency felt wrong. He said I asked who authorized it, and I was told the Calder Group handled it. He did not want a fight, but he did not want his name attached to something messy either. He agreed to provide the communications he had received and to confirm that the trust income was being positioned for transfer away from the scholarship purpose. By the time I drove back toward Edina, the exhibit pack felt heavier in my bag, not because of paper weight, but because of what it represented. Proof changes rooms. Proof changes who gets to speak. At the next family gathering, Paige made sure to test whether my silence would break. She cornered me near the kitchen island while Cynthia performed host duties and Grant pretended everything was normal. Paige leaned close enough that her perfume felt like a warning, and she said with a bored sneer, "No one here cares about your little feelings." She smiled after she said it like she had delivered a clever line in a show. My face stayed still, but something in my chest ached with the old instinct to be understood, to be believed. I swallowed that instinct because it was not the tool that would save me. Inside my head, I answered her with the sentence I had learned to live by over the past weeks. I do not need them to believe me. I need the paperwork to speak. I walked away without giving her the satisfaction of an argument. The gala approached quickly, and with it came a new kind of pressure. Cynthia began sending texts about attire and seating and appearances, as if the perfect arrangement of bodies and outfits could rewrite what was already written in bank trails and trust clauses. I played along just enough to stay in the room. On the afternoon of the event, I arrived early under the excuse of helping, because Cynthia liked the idea of me being useful. The venue was polished and cold, a hotel ballroom dressed up as community service with banners and polite lighting, and a stage that waited like a mouth. As vendors moved around setting up, a man in a suit approached Cynthia and Tom with a clipboard. I recognized him from a distance as someone tied to the accounting side, one of those professionals who attends these events because money likes witnesses. When he glanced toward me, I caught a flicker in his expression, the quick narrowing of focus that happens when a name or a detail lands. Later, as I passed near him, he asked casually what line of work I was in. I answered with one term, a single professional word that most people never use unless they live near the infrastructure of wealth fiduciary. His eyebrows lifted a fraction, then he looked at me again longer this time, as if he was putting pieces together. It was small, subtle, but it was a hint of the power I had been holding back. People in that world recognize competence the way predators recognize weakness. Ms. Rowan texted me just before the official program began. If they sign tonight, we freeze it tomorrow. I stared at the screen and felt the room narrow into a single point, the moment where the trap would close or snap. I typed back with steady hands, then we go tonight. The ballroom lights softened as if warmth could be manufactured, and Cynthia stood at the podium like a woman who believed a microphone could crown her. Behind her, a screen looped smiling photos of scholarship recipients and ribbon cuttings, the kind of images that made donors feel clean. Tom hovered off to the side with a hand on his jacket button, scanning the room for familiar faces: bankers, business owners, church committee leaders, the people whose approval meant everything to them. Paige drifted near the front with a glass in her hand, watching me like a guard dog trained to interpret silence as danger. Luke lounged 2 chairs behind her with the relaxed posture of someone who had never had to earn the word future. Grant stood beside me, close enough to be a statement, not close enough to be comfort. And when I looked at him, I saw the same practiced smile he used when he said they are joking. My phone buzzed once in my purse, Ms. Rowan's earlier message still burning in my mind. If they sign tonight, we freeze it tomorrow, and my reply, then we go tonight. Cynthia began her speech with the tone of a woman performing morality. She talked about legacy and community and responsibility, and then she unveiled what she called the family's next chapter, the legacy plan. She said it with a bright smile as if she had invented generosity itself. She described a new structure, a modern approach, a way to protect the family vision while expanding impact words that sounded noble until you listened for what she avoided naming. She never said scholarship. She never said beneficiary. She never said amendment. She never said transfer to holding LLC. She simply said alignment, stewardship, and flexibility. And people nodded because they wanted to believe rich people were rich for good reasons. As she spoke, I watched the table where the bank representative sat, a woman in a dark blazer with a neat name badge, attentive but cautious. I watched the CPA near her, a man with a pen poised the kind of person who measured the world in entries and explanations. And I watched Mr. Calder positioned near the aisle with a folder that looked too heavy for a simple gala program. Cynthia's voice rose as she reached her crescendo, the moment she would ask for applause, and then usher everyone into the signing phase, like it was a photo opportunity. That was when I stood. I did not rush. I did not shake. I did not ask permission. The chair legs made a small sound on the carpet, and in a room built for polite noise, that small sound felt like a bell. Heads turned. Cynthia paused mid-sentence, her smile tightening at the corners, as if she had tasted something bitter. I walked forward with my hands empty because I did not need props. I needed attention. Grant whispered my name under his breath, not a warning exactly, more like a plea for calm, as if calm was all that mattered. I stopped a few feet from the podium and looked at Cynthia, then at Tom, then at Paige, letting my gaze include them all. When I spoke, my voice was steady and clear, not loud, not soft, the tone of someone stating facts that will exist, whether anyone likes them or not. Cynthia, I said you just announced a legacy plan. Before you ask this room to celebrate it, I need to correct the story you are selling. Cynthia tried to laugh it off, tilting her head with that practiced expression of amused confusion. Ivy, sweetheart, she said, this is not the time. The word sweetheart landed like a hand on my shoulder, meant to steer me, to shrink me, to make me look emotional. I did not flinch. It is exactly the time, I said, because you chose this room to turn paperwork into a performance. So let us talk about what you have been doing in private. A ripple moved through the crowd, the sensation people get when they realize the evening might become memorable. Paige's eyes narrowed. Tom's jaw tightened. Cynthia's smile stayed on, but her eyes sharpened with calculation. I continued, and I made myself slow down on purpose, not giving them a chance to interrupt with drama. I want to start with the way you framed me, I said, because it explains why you thought you could do this. You called me the affordable option. You let Paige joke that Grant found me on a coupon app. The words were plain, the insult raw, and the room shifted again. People exchanging looks, discomfort rising because cruelty sounds uglier outside a dining room. Paige made a sharp sound, half laugh, half protest. Cynthia lifted a hand like she was guiding a child. "That is not what we meant," she said. "You are being sensitive." That is when I turned my head just enough to include the audience again. Sensitive is a useful word when someone wants to avoid accountability, I said. Now I will show you what this is really about. I held up the first page of my exhibit pack, not waving it, simply letting it exist where everyone could see a title: Harbor Scholarship Trust, Amendment and Beneficiary Reassignment. Cynthia's eyes flicked to it, then away as if refusing to look, could erase it. Point 1, I said, the scholarship fund is being changed from its stated purpose into a structure designed to move control away from scholarships and toward a holding entity. It is not a modernization. It is a repurposing. It is taking money meant for kids and routing it into a vehicle that serves this family. I saw the bank representative lean slightly forward. The CPA's pen moved. Cynthia tried to interrupt, her voice bright and quick. "Ivy, you do not understand how foundations work." Tom stepped closer, his face rigid. "Stop," he hissed low enough that only the nearest rows could hear. I did not look at him. I understood it well enough to ask for an accounting, I said. And that brings me to point 2. I lifted the next page, a simple chart of payments and dates. The money trail shows funds moving to Luke and Paige. I did not call them criminals. I did not need to. I stated what the numbers said. Consulting fee payments, I said, time to match Luke's debt deadlines. Expenses that do not look like scholarships. A new car that looks like a celebration paid with money that was never meant for luxury. Luke's posture changed, his relaxed slouch turning into a stiff, alert stillness. Paige's face flushed with anger. "That is a lie," she snapped loud enough that several people turned toward her. Cynthia raised a hand toward Paige as if to calm her, but her own composure began to wobble at the edges. "Ivy," she said, "you are confused. You have been snooping. You are taking things out of context." She leaned toward the audience, voice softening into concern, the classic move the gaslight delivered as care. "Ivy has been under a lot of stress," Cynthia said. "Weddings can be overwhelming. Sometimes people imagine threats where there are none." I felt the room hesitate, some people wanting to believe the elegant woman at the podium, some people uneasy because the paperwork in my hands looked too specific to be imagination. That was when Mr. Calder stepped forward, just one step, then another, until he was visible to the bank representative and the CPA. He held up his folder, his hands not shaking. I watched Cynthia's face as she recognized the weight of his decision. Calder cleared his throat and said, "I have the accounting file." The words fell heavy and clean. He moved to the table where the bank representative and the CPA sat and placed the file down in front of them, not theatrically, professionally, the way evidence is offered when someone has decided to save themselves. The CPA opened it. The bank representative looked at Cynthia with a new kind of expression, one that did not ask for stories, only explanations. Tom went pale. Not a dramatic faint, just a draining of color that made his age show. Paige lost control, stepping forward as if she could grab the file back by force of entitlement. Cynthia caught her arm and hissed something under her breath, then turned back to me with a smile that was now fully strained. "Ivy," she said, "you are embarrassing yourself. This is family business. You are not family. The sentence hit the room like a slap because she forgot for one moment that witnesses change behavior. I breathed once slow, and then I delivered the line that had been forming in me since the foyer, since the folder slid across the table, since she does not need to understand. She is not family. I looked directly at Cynthia and said, "Money changed everything, but not the way you think. You did not change when money showed up. You changed when you thought I had none." The silence that followed was not polite. It was stunned. It was the room recalculating who had power. People who had smiled at Cynthia seconds earlier stared at their hands at their drinks, at the folder now open on the table. Grant stood frozen, his face pulled tight with confusion and shame, the cost of his silence arriving all at once. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but my voice stayed even. If you are watching this and you have ever been judged for looking simple, I want you to stay with me, because this part matters. I said then, I turned my face slightly to include the whole room, and I delivered the CTA like a blade wrapped in velvet. Comment: finish it if you want what happened after they tried to crawl back. Cynthia's mouth opened as if she would try one more time to talk her way out, but the CPA lifted his eyes and asked a question that was not emotional, not personal, just fatal. "Can you explain these transfers?" Cynthia did not answer. She could not. I did not wait for her to find a new mask. I held up the final page, the one that made every insult and every shove and every forced smile lead to a single deadline. And the transfer, I said, letting the pause hang long enough to make the room lean in, is scheduled for midnight. The room did not explode after midnight the way movies promise. It tightened instead like a knot pulled too fast. Phones vibrated quietly at first, then more insistently, as the bank representative stepped aside to make calls and the CPA asked for space and time. The gala dissolved into clusters of whispers and careful exits. By morning, the transaction was frozen, pending review, and the word pending felt heavier than a verdict because it meant scrutiny had begun. The first call came from Cynthia before noon. Her voice was unrecognizable, sweet, rounded, gentle, as if the night before had been a misunderstanding. "Ivy," she said, using my name like an apology. "We are family. We should talk about this privately." I listened without interrupting, because silence lets people reveal their true ask. She said the foundation would clarify. She said donors were confused. She said stress makes people say things they do not mean. I thought about the words she had used in the foyer and at the table and on the stage, and I realized she was not asking for forgiveness. She was asking for control back. I said only one sentence: "You do not get to hurt me in private and beg in public." Then I ended the call. The second call came from Paige, and it startled me how fast her posture had changed. Her voice shook, and she rushed her words like she feared the line would go dead. "We did not mean it," she said. I was joking. "You know how I am. This is getting blown out of proportion." She asked me to fix it. She said I could post something supportive or say it was a misunderstanding. She said, "Please." And the words sounded foreign coming from her mouth. I pictured her gripping my wrist in the kitchen and smiling when she told me no one cared about my feelings. I said nothing until she finished, then repeated the same sentence. "You do not get to hurt me in private and beg in public." She cried then and accused me of ruining the family and hung up. The third call did not come. It came as a message from Luke, and it was short and frantic. His loan. Payment was due, and accounts were locked, and he needed time. He asked if I could talk to the bank for him. He did not apologize. He asked for help, like it was his right. I set the phone down and let the message sit unanswered, because the absence of a reply was an answer. Grant came over that afternoon unannounced. He looked smaller than he had at the gala, like the air had been pulled from him. He sat at my kitchen table and ran his hands over his face and said, "Can you explain this to everyone? They think you are attacking them." He said, "Attacking, like telling the truth was violence." I asked him a question I had avoided until that moment. Do you think what they did was acceptable? He hesitated long enough for the answer to arrive before his words did. He said, I just wanted peace. I nodded because that was finally honest. Peace for him had always meant my silence. I told him calmly that I would not explain anything to anyone. I had already explained it with documents. I told him the bank freeze was not my doing. It was the consequence of choices he watched and minimized. He said they are panicking, and I said they should be. He asked if I could at least talk to his mother again. I looked at him and felt something close and final settle into place. I said the sentence one last time so he would understand it was not anger, it was boundary. You do not get to hurt me in private and beg in public. He left without arguing because there was nothing left to argue about. The messages kept coming from numbers I did not save from cousins and friends and community members who had been at the gala. People asked for context and reassurance, and I gave none, because reassurance is another form of cover. I forwarded the formal accounting notice to Ms. Rowan, and she replied with a short confirmation, received monitoring. The CPA email arrived that evening with subject line formal investigation opened. The words were clean and devastating at the same time. It meant timelines and interviews and reconciliations. It meant the question had shifted from feelings to facts. I sat at my table and let the quiet return. The house felt mine again, not because I had won something, but because I had stopped surrendering it. The night did not end with a speech or applause. It ended with a locked transaction and a family discovering that control does not survive daylight. The investigation did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived the way real consequences do, through letters, meetings, and quiet changes in posture. The accounting firm issued its findings in clear language that left no room for interpretation. The Harbor Scholarship. Trust funds had been used outside their stated purpose. The transfers into a holding structure and the payments labeled as consulting did not align with fiduciary obligations. The breach was confirmed not as an opinion but as a conclusion supported by dates, amounts, and authorizations. Receipts mattered, and there were many. The trustee was removed according to the trust terms, not as punishment but as procedure, and the requirement to repay misused funds followed just as plainly. Properties tied to the trust were placed back under controls specified by the original language reserves restored, and income redirected to scholarships as intended. Oversight increased, and the room for creative explanations disappeared. Luke felt the change first because his access dried up without ceremony. Accounts he relied on were no longer available, and the payments he assumed would arrive simply did not. His messages grew shorter, then stopped. Paige was contacted regarding misuse, and reimbursement requests followed. She reacted with outrage. At first, then silence, when she realized outrage did not move numbers. Tom faced consequences of a different kind. The documented incidents of unwanted contact and pressure resulted in a protective boundary that limited his access and communication. The order was specific and unglamorous, exactly the kind that reshapes daily life. Grant learned what public quiet costs. The community that once nodded at dinners now asked questions without smiling. His silence was noticed because silence reads differently after truth enters the room. Ivy was mentioned in conversations with a new tone, careful, respectful, measured, and Grant felt the shift like a draft through a door he had assumed was closed. I watched all of this from a distance, not out of spite, but because proximity was no longer required. The relief I felt was physical, a loosening across my shoulders, a return of sleep I did not celebrate. I did not post. I did not explain. The trust terms spoke, and the receipts did their work. When the message from Grant arrived late one night, it was only 3 words I did not know. I looked at the screen and felt no surge of anger, only a quiet clarity. He knew enough to stay silent, and that knowledge was sufficient. 6 months later, my life was quiet in a way that felt earned, not empty. The noise that had filled my days was gone, and in its place was routine. I trusted mornings that began without dread work, that ended without knots in my stomach. Evenings that belonged to me, I had moved into a smaller place with light that stayed late, and neighbors who did not know my story and did not need to. The Harbor Scholarship Trust was back where it belonged, not as a headline, not as a scandal, but as a functioning promise. Scholarships were awarded again with clear criteria, checks went to students, not family accounts, and the name of the original founder was restored in the paperwork and spoken with respect. Instead of convenience, I attended one award meeting quietly sitting near the back and listening, as a first-generation student, thanked a room of adults who finally did their job. The money felt different when it did what it was meant to do. It felt clean. I did not announce anything about myself because there was nothing to announce. My power had never been about spectacle. It was about choices I met. Ms. Rowan for coffee one afternoon, and she studied me over the rim of her cup with a look that held both satisfaction and curiosity. She said simply, I suspected. I nodded and told her the truth. Without details, I work in asset management under a non-disclosure framework. My position requires discretion and discipline and a tolerance for silence. She smiled like someone who recognizes a professional and said, You handled this like one. I did not correct her. I did not need to. The work I returned to was the same work I had always done, helping structures last, helping intent survive pressure, helping money serve its stated purpose instead of swallowing it. I did not reconnect with Grant because endings do not need explanations to be real. I did receive a letter from Cynthia months later, written in careful cursive on expensive paper. Family is everything, she wrote, as if repetition could transform meaning. I read it once and folded it without anger and without reply. The answer was already clear. Family is not control. The choice to protect the trust had cost me access to a name and given me back my peace. I share this because someone listening needs to hear it. What would you have done? Stay quiet or protect the trust? Next time it starts with a will reading and a pen that would not stop shaking.